Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to look at the Nixon Administration. Now before we begin our lecture proper today, I just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture uh, we looked at the women's rights movement, the women's movement of the mid 20th century, and we also looked at the other pivotal moments during the countercultural revolution, namely the sexual revolution, the gay rights movement, and of course abortion. And then we also looked at the efforts made to undermine those social revolutions, namely the efforts to undermine the women's revolution, the sexual revolution, and of course abortion rights, headed by Phyllis Schlafly, who herself was a quite remarkable woman who really fit the archetype of the rosy derivative woman. Here, her roar, really sort of really sort of really sort of just sort of all accomplished figure, the type of figure, the type of uh, personality that really the women's movement, the movement that she argued against, championed and called for, and said should have a larger role in the history of the republic. Um, Before we get sidetracked and get going on in our recap, I'd like to jump into our lecture, and I'd like to say that much like Phyllis Schlafly, Richard Nixon was a paradox. In many ways, he was a member of the Society of Friends, otherwise known as Quakers, but he was also a World War II veteran, having served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. He entered the national consciousness, had a hardliner on communism. He was a very noted hardline anti-communist congressman during the 1940s. Have we discussed when we looked at when we looked at our lectures on the early Cold War and on McCarthyism. You can almost sort of see. So you can definitely see similarities between him and McCarthy in that he sort of rode being a communist hardliner to 3 terms in the House of Representatives and to a Senate victory. And he also rode being a hardliner on communism to becoming to being picked up as Dwight D. Eisenhower's running mate in 1952. So you quickly saw his rise there. But he was also noted for, particularly during the 1940s, for being an opponent of Alger Hisses. Before campaigning for a seat in the Senate against a woman named Helen Gahagan Douglas, Nixon made a well-received comment about his opponent, Miss Gahagan Douglas, being being pink, and this was seen as what was known as red baiting, in which he was sort of taxing her on being light on communism or being tainted by communism, and he called her pink. He said she was pink right down to her underwear. And pink had this sort of dual meaning. On one part, it's feminine, but on the other hand, it's contaminated. Pink is a sort of lighter shade of red. So by calling her pink, he was saying that she was contaminated by red communist ideas. Nixon was picked up by Eisenhower to be a vice president based off of his strong strong reputation as being anti-communist, as being someone who was right there in the thick of things, in the good fight. He was seen as a beneficial ally for Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower had no political expertise except for policy regarding the military, and that was only in um, uh, minor instances. Eisenhower was a strong believer in the tradition that in the Republic, the military officers, should not engage in politics or allow themselves to be manipulated by political intrigue. Nixon was brought in to serve as an enforcer, someone to do the hard work that Eisenhower couldn't, someone to go out there and once being told something, to go out there and see to it that it was done. He was a pusher, essentially, but he was not a member of the inner circle of Eisenhower. Much the same way that Truman was not a Roosevelt confidant, he was not in Roosevelt's inner circle. Much the same way that we saw that Lyndon Johnson was not a insider during the Kennedy administration. Nixon wasn't an insider during the Eisenhower administration. He wasn't really the last voice to be heard in a room. He wasn't someone whom the president had a lot of political trust in. During the nominations, for example, there was a scandalous moment in which Nixon had been accused of bribery. It had been accused that he had been on the take from a number of people, and it came out that he had received a dog, a little cocker spaniel named Checkers, and he had to, and what was arguably one of the greatest moments of his political career, he gave what's known as the Checkers speech, in which he sat down and he spoke with the American public, and it was this great sort of instance of the press being completely on the politician's side. They came in and gave him very generous lighting, and he made this heartfelt pitch to the people, and it was reciprocated. There wasn't any sort of great grievance against Dick Nixon having gotten the dog. He was sort of forgiven. That was the sort of the overall impact of the Checker speech, was that he was forgiven this sin of impropriety of having accepted the dog that was adopted by his family, that was taken in by his family. Now, as I stated, he was not an insider in the Roosevelt administration, in the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower restricted his political role and it was really sort of frustrating and really sort of a bit eye-catching and perplexing that on the one hand you have a man who is the Republic's second executive officer and the president of the Senate, as the vice president is, but he really had very little to do. He didn't have much to do. He didn't have a lot of say or anything else. And that is a running theme throughout the history of the United States, with the exception of John Adams, who insisted upon his right to sit in on and participate in the Senate sessions in his capacity as the president of the Senate. Vice presidents were normally kept in the background. The relationships between Joe Biden and Barack Obama is sort of a bit different, but in that Biden was able to pitch ideas to Obama, or able to discuss policy with Obama. But as far as, let's say, Johnson or Walter Mondale or even George Bush Sr. Having a great say on the affairs of the Reagan administration, that simply wasn't there. That simply didn't happen. They were very much kept in the background during those administrations. Now, despite his years of experience and expertise and being selected and endorsed by Eisenhower, Nixon lost the election in 1960 to John Kennedy, as we already discovered. In 1962, Dick Nixon was attempting to repair his political fortunes, and he decided to run for the governorship of California. But he lost that election as well. He lost to Pat Brown. Nixon seemed to be finished politically. Not many politicians anywhere can lose two elections in such a short time frame, two elections, 2 years, and revive their careers. And it's very telling that during his concession speech, which is described as bitter, had a bitter moment, a bitter exchange between Nixon and the reporters present. You can very clearly see the anger and the discomfort and in his body language and in his voice. And very famously, Nixon let out this very bitter remark, very bitter and very emotional remark. He told the reporters, "You won't have old Dick Nixon around to kick around anymore." And it's a complete reversal of his early success with the press. Emphasized by the Checker speech. His relationship with the press at this point had been broken down. The coverage that he received during the Alger Hiss trial, during the Pumpkin Papers affair, during of course the Checker speech, which I just mentioned, which generated this enormous sympathy for Nixon and his family. But by this time, Nixon was nicknamed Tricky Dick. He was Tricky Dick Nixon by this time, and his relationship with the press was rooted in mutual dislike and suspicion. The dislike of Nixon was so intense that some reporters made these very observant comments about his facial features, namely his nose. Gary Willis had a very hostile description of Nixon's nose, but there was also his eyes and his hands. Sort of had this propensity to rub his hands together in a very sinister manner. A lot of people made comments on that. His eyes, the movement of his eyes, people made comments on that. There's a lot of hostility at this point to Nixon. Now, after his defeat in 1962, Nixon moved to New York City. And he worked through much of the 1960s as a lawyer while planning his comeback. Now, he regularly sought out sources of support for his political aspirations within the Republican Party. Within the party, Nixon's profile began to rise. Almost immediately as it hit its low point, it began to rise to higher and higher points, to higher and higher plateaus. The biggest sort of boon to Nixon, the biggest sort of upswing in his popularity within the Republican Party came in 1964 with the defeat of Barry Goldwater. Goldwater went down in a flaming defeat, and that defeat elevated Nixon's stock within the party as he became the elder statesman or the senior man standing within the Republican Party. Rapidly, from 1965 until 1968, he rebuilt his reputation and the plausibility of his strength as a candidate for the presidency. In 1968, he was able to do just that. He was able to take advantage of the social upheavals of the decade of the 1960s, and he was able to manipulate events to his benefit. Nixon realized in 1968 that due to the Kennedy and Johnson administration's stance on civil rights and the war in Vietnam, that the old Dixiecrats, who had consistently voted for Democrats since the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, really Dixiecrats had voted consistently for the Democratic Party since the founding of the party, since the party was known as the Jacksonian Democrats, going all the way back to 1828, 1832, over 100 years. The entirety of the life of that party, we have seen the Dixiecrats vote for Democratic Party candidates, but civil rights was the breaking point. They for those old Dixiecrats, for those old segregationists, civil rights was a line they were not willing to cross. They were not willing to support it. Lyndon Johnson had been able to cajole people into it, but Lyndon Johnson was he had been a very prominent Texan congressman and a very prominent Texas senator. He sort of had the clout to do so. During this campaign, policies like affirmative action and the Equal Rights Amendment helped to nudge old guard segregationists and conservative reactionaries into the Nixon camp. Nixon did not come out and saying that he did not come out and said he was going to overturn any of those laws, or that he was going to not support, or that he wasn't going to support any of those laws. But he also didn't say that he wasn't going to. During his campaign, he called on support of a group that he deemed the silent majority, the people who weren't out there protesting and demonstrating in the streets, those who had jobs and adhered to a traditional American value structure, to adhere to traditional core values of the Republic, which he claimed were being violated by the radical extremists plaguing the Republic. Now, one of Nixon's challengers in 1968 was George Wallace. George Wallace was a hardline segregationist, and he was also the former governor of Alabama, who was campaigned in 1968 as an independent for the presidency. Both campaigned on a quote-unquote law and order platform. Moreover, Wallace had a fiery rhetoric that denigrated the students and protesters and delighted the demographic that they competed over. Wallace would label the student protesters, he would call them draft dodgers, pot smokers, as well as just long hair. And he had this remark about young men with long hair. Very traditional, very hardline, very fiery rhetoric that appealed to his base. All the things that the Wallace campaign had, that the Nixon campaign had to compete with. Now, Nixon had a hard time getting the upper hand on Wallace for the anti-counterculture demographic. And also, just to go back home, Wallace, I'm thinking about it, and he also had some very clever remarks, I guess you can say, some very low cunning remarks regarding welfare cheats. So the entire array of people who would oppose and denigrate the law and order platform that both of these men wanted to implement. Wallace had a snarky remark, a snarky comment for both of them. In the end, though, Nixon defeated Wallace and gained over 30 million votes compared to Wallace's 10 million votes. Now, the Democratic Party, for their part, had gone through a very bruising and destructive nomination cycle. There was a lot of this disillusionment surrounding the party that summer. Richard Daley in Chicago mirrored Bull Connor of Birmingham as he set Chicago police on political protesters, which generally demoralized the party faithful and cast the party as being in utter chaos compared to the Republican Party, who during their convention in Miami had this very orderly and contained nomination process that saw Dick Nixon emerge with no sort of controversy, no sort of adverse action whatsoever. Now, Nixon hit the ground running after his election, orchestrating something of a foreign policy revolution by opening up diplomatic relations with China. Going back 20 years to the end of the Chinese Revolution and the consolidation of mainland China by Mao Zedong, in 1949, the United States government had granted diplomatic recognition to the defeated Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, based on the island of Formosa or Taiwan. Now, through the Truman, Eisenhower, especially through the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy, and of course the Johnson administration, the United States refused to acknowledge or entertain notions of diplomatic relations with China. By 1969, it was very clear to all that China had the potential to be a great ally for the United States in the years to come. Nixon sent Henry Kissinger on a series of trips to China to hammer out the details of an international relationship between the two powers. In 1972, Nixon made a very public, very well orchestrated trip to China, which remains one of the most important and remarkable events of the later 20th century, let alone during the Nixon administration. This visit, officially began the slow reincorporation of China into the sphere of United States diplomacy. Full diplomatic relations would be established in 1979 under Jimmy Carter, but there were a number of advantages to reestablishing diplomatic relations with China. Now, Nixon began the process, Carter finished it. But the motivations, one, was that the number one for these motivating reasons to reestablish diplomatic relations with China was that it deprived the Soviet ally of a potential ally. If the United States and the Soviet Union went to war, China, with this great resources, with this great surplus of men and war material, if China's friends with both of them, China may just ought to be neutral. It may just stand on the sidelines, which isn't the best strategy for engaging in an all-out war with a nuclear power, but it's also not one to sneeze at. Nixon also understood that going all the way back to 1949, it seemed as though the PRC will fall into Soviet orbit, but there have been a number of unresolved issues between the PRC, the People's Republic of China, or Communist China, and the Soviet Union, or the USSR. The PRC and the Soviet Union had a number of unresolved issues, and they simmered, and they led to intra-communist tensions. Nixon, who was a great politician in his own right, understood that he could exploit this rift to his political advantage. Nixon also believed that the Cold War should be vigorously prosecuted, but not allowed to go to the point of no return. It was also realized that in the Salt-Won Treaty of 1972 with the Soviet Union. Now this is all really remembered, best remembered and best summed up by Nixon's trip to Moscow. Shortly after the visit to China, Nixon embarked on a series of diplomatic coups in terms of U.S.-Soviet relations. One was this landmark agreement to limit nuclear testing and nuclear missile production. It was Nixon who haltingly and extricately began the process of removing or limiting United States forces in Vietnam, reducing the troop number to from 500,000, from 500,000 to less than 100,000 to around 70,000 in his first 2 years in office. Nixon also championed what he called Vietnamization. That is, gradually handing the course and conduct of the war over to the South Vietnamese government. He withdrew the last American troops in 1973 after suspending the draft. The compulsory draft was never abolished in the United States. It was merely suspended. An interesting fact that most people find alarming when they hear. Now, doing so was a great suspending the draft. Getting the draft suspended was a great domestic coup. It was one of the major spark points for the protest and the turmoil of the 1960s. Now, the slowness with which he did remove the troops from Vietnam, and his attempt to expand the war to Cambodia really counteracted both of those measures, ended the war in Vietnam and abolishing the draft. The fact that he attempted to expand the war and the fact that he did so very slowly really, undermined his efforts to sort of reel in any sort of lukewarm anti-war protester, any sort of counter-culture revolutionary groups or individuals into its orbit. It really sort of limited his appeal amongst those groups. Nixon, he remained as hated as ever by those groups, and there was no reconsideration whatsoever of him being a like or a redeemed figure. The slowness by which he did so limited his appeal, and the appreciation for his efforts were really sort of not. It didn't really it didn't really hit a lot of people because of the narrowness of the appeal, because of the narrowness of his efforts. Now, he was able to ensure South Vietnamese viability, and the ensuing events of his presidency made it impossible for him to return to Vietnam. On the domestic front, Nixon accepted most of Johnson's Great Society legislation, partly because he inherited a Democratic majority in Congress, and he couldn't really say, well, I'm going to dismantle all of this stuff to them. They simply would not have permitted that. School desegregation went forward faster than it had under either Kennedy or Johnson in the early years of the Nixon administration, which was now being run by the Democrats, who were in favor of desegregation, and the courts were adjudicating cases in ways that facilitated integration. Now, one major figure of the era was Spiro Agnew. Now, Agnew was the former governor of Maryland, and Agnew traveled widely during his tenure in office to spread the word and to really stump in the political sense, that is, to go up there and to engage in these speaking these speaking demonstrations in favor of Nixon administration policies. Now, Agnew stumped widely during his time as vice president, widely during the administration, and he spread the word of the administration's dislike of radicals and of media personnel. Nixon came to view the media as the leading or principal ally of the social protesters, and among Agnew's more catchy catchphrases was this. And this is one that he used for the press. He called the press an effete corps of impudent snobs. So, you know, a very like open dagger sort of moment where he let it be known just how lowly they were thought of, just how revile they were thought of in the White House. He labeled foreign policy critics the nattering nabobs of negativism. So Agnew definitely won with a penchant for insulting rhetoric, not as good, not as fiery or eye-catching as anything George Wallace had to say, but still pretty cutting, pretty damning. We'll break here and we'll come back with part 2 of our discussion on Dick Nixon. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.